Good afternoon, and thanks very much for joining us today for this first Webstival of the Climate Europe 2 project, which will last for the next 2 days. I'm lucky enough to start in this first session, this Gala opening, and the welcoming words to all the participants to this Webstival to counts on Chris Iwitz from the World Meteorological Organization, and a very good friend, and Jean Doussard from the European Commission, the Directorate General for Research and Innovation. In the next few minutes, we'll try to set a bit the context of this Webstival, the history, where it comes from, and also what it actually means for research in Europe. Maybe, Chris, if you want to open your video and say a few words as well, that would be very nice, especially because Chris, apart from being in charge of climate services at WMO, he was a pioneer, and he has been the first coordinator of a project similar to Climate Europe 2, actually Climate Europe without any number, actually, because we never thought that there would be a second Climate Europe. So Chris was the coordinator of the one and only Climate Europe, and it was a very successful project and the predecessor of Climate Europe 2 in many ways, including the great invention of the Webstivals. So Chris, welcome, and good afternoon. Maybe you want to introduce a bit the experience of the last few years and what is happening in this brilliant future that you're facing now at WMO, which is so relevant to us.
Thanks, Paco. Can you not see me? I have my camera open. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you.
Good. Hello, everybody. Yep, I'm Chris Hewitt. I am now at the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization. It says UK on the screen. I'm actually in Switzerland. It's a sunny day here in Geneva. But before I came here, I was at the UK Met Office and involved, as Paco said, in, well, lots of European Commission funded projects. That's how Paco and I met, the Ensembles project, probably about 15 or 20 years ago. And I was the coordinator of the Climate Europe project. Ironically, Paco, it didn't have a number originally. It was called ECOMS 2. So there is some history here. I won't go into the long history, but there was a recognition by many people and fully recognized by the European Commission that the climate service landscape was becoming very busy. There were many actors, activities, projects involved in developing, delivering, and using climate services, particularly in Europe. And the European Commission had been very supportive of activities for many decades. And so they funded what was the Climate Europe project. So that ran from, I think it was 2015 for 5 years. And yes, it was the predecessor to Climate Europe 2. The idea was to bring together as many of the actors around Europe and beyond Europe as possible, but focusing on Europe, to share knowledge, improve synergies between the different activities and the different groups, try and avoid fragmentation. There was quite a lot of fragmentation before Climate Europe started, and we tried to reduce that. You can't completely reduce it, but we certainly tried to do that. And so with this managed network, as Paco's just alluded to, we tried to explore and adopt some different and innovative approaches to bring this network together. So when we set out our project plan, we first thought of having face-to-face networking events. So back in 2015, the pre-COVID days, which we all remember, we created this idea of festivals. So face-to-face gatherings of people, not conferences, not really workshops, but a very interactive and engaging environment to bring people together. So we came up with festivals, and then COVID struck. And so we then had to move everything online, and we came up with the idea of Webstivals, which I'm very glad that Climate Europe 2 has carried on. We also explored the use of art social media, all sorts of things. Maybe I should share my screen and illustrate some of these rather than me just talk. Please tell me if you can see my screen, Paco.
We can see your screen very well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I've only got a few slides just to talk through this. So the Climate Europe festivals, so originally before COVID, as I said, these were face-to-face events. So there are various nice photos at the bottom of the screen there with different environments. So bottom left, having group discussions around a table, maybe with coffee, poster sessions, but not your traditional conference posters. So a very interactive environment with people engaging. And then we had some music in the background at some of those. We had a scribe. I'll show the scribing later, but the third picture at the bottom there is somebody drawing the meeting. There's a European Commission representative, our friend Diogo of the European Commission came along and gave very useful words, etc., etc. So we brought people together in very different ways to share experience and knowledge, discuss climate services and network. And then, as I said, so we had originally imagined face-to-face festivals. We had the first one in Valencia, second one in Belgrade, and we were going to have the next one in Riga, but we had to move online. I'll come back to Webstival in a minute. So we tried other things as well. We had a very active website, which Climate Europe 2 will have as well. And we started to use social media a lot. So I know it seems that's what everyone does now, but back when we developed the project proposal, it wasn't such an active environment. So we had a very successful Twitter campaign and activities. We used LinkedIn and some various other ways of doing it. We had a good, very active LinkedIn group. And then we were very keen to make sure that we reached out across Europe as well. So traditionally, a lot of the climate service activities would take place in perhaps the more western and northern side of Europe. And we very much tried to expand our activities to be more engaging and try and reach out as best as we could to underrepresented regions and underrepresented groups. So gender was a big challenge. We had huge success in trying to improve the gender imbalance. And then this heat map here shows how we really were quite successful in spreading out activities in Europe. So this was a heat map, I think, from the first Webstival that we ran. So people joining from all over Europe. And that is one of the big advantages of these online meetings, is that you don't have to travel. So you can bring people in from more diverse places relatively easily. Whereas in the festivals, we did have more of a bias towards groups from Western, Central and Northern Europe, and not so many groups from Eastern Europe. But the Webstivals were very successful in reaching out into other parts of Europe. We also tried to bring in lots of different groups. So this was a colleague of mine from the Met Office, Bex Parpit. I don't know if she's online. Hello, Bex, if you are. Did lots of approaches to try and bring together the different groups. And this was just a way of getting people involved in one of the Webstivals. Where are you? Where are you based? What's your organization? And this again showed some rather nice distribution of the different groups across Europe. And then we had expert teams. So we did lots of networking through various forms, but we also took on trying to come up with recommendations. The European Commission was very keen to have recommendations from a range of groups around Europe, and Climate Europe gave them access to that group. Recommendations for what would be the future priorities, perhaps for funding under European Commission funding. And one of the topics which many of you on the call, I think, are keen on, and Climate Europe 2 is taking this on, with standards for climate services. This is just an example where we brought experts together through some workshops and some facilitated activities and produced some documents and publications, and we recommended a need to advance on standards for climate services. I don't know if Paco will talk about this in a minute or not, but Climate Europe 2 is now taking this forward, which is excellent news. And then finally, we also tried to be creative with the use of art. So we had various, like I said, we had social media, but we had an artist drawing lots of our meetings. So this is just one picture taken from one of the meetings where the artist would stand there and actually draw the meeting. This is, I'm shamelessly advertising here, a paper which summarizes everything I've just been trying to talk about quickly here. So there's a paper we produced in the Climate Services Journal, which summarized the main activities in Climate Europe and some of the recommendations going forward. So I think I'll stop there, Paco. That was a quick run through in Climate Europe, and I'm absolutely delighted that Climate Europe 2 is now underway. We're having this Webstival, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. now the attendants might understand a bit better how Climate Europe 2 came in, and also how much it's borrowing from the successes that are taking place in that were taking place in Climate Europe. So the point is that there is a lot that is coming up from Climate Europe into Climate Europe 2, and at this point I would take advantage of the floor to show a few slides that will introduce what we are trying to do here, which basically is a project funded by the Horizon Europe program that is a bit bigger than Climate Europe was, and that, as I said, is receiving a lot of inspiration of the great work that Chris was leading in the implementation of Climate Europe. Chris has already mentioned what climate services are, or at least hinted at in with some of the diagrams that he showed that were really inspirational. And somehow what Climate Europe made clear is that climate services should be demand driven, and that came also from a lot of the other projects funded by the Horizon 2020 program of the European Commission. That basically made obvious that the decision-making processes are the ones that should be driving the generation of climate information, and that this climate information should be co-produced in the framework of the climate service provided. However, as Chris also said, there is a lack of consensus on how much climate services can be standardized, in particular, the different processes that enter into the climate services provision. So Climate Europe 2 is, as I said before, the coordination and support action funded by Horizon Europe that will be running until 2027, and that aims to support and develop an equitable community of climate services in Europe. And that the word equitable is key here, because as Chris also said, we want to bring into this exercise those underrepresented communities, regions, and territories that have a lot to say about what climate services should be. And this is done with the goal of increasing the uptake of climate services, supported by a number of recommendations that should make their way into the standardization of climate services. The project has three main goals: the standardization, which has been probably one of the main driving forces behind the consortium that has been put together to implement this project, but also the support of a community that was already started by Climate Europe, and that can only grow and be made stronger and more vocal at the European level and beyond. And by doing this, we expect that climate services will be uptaken in an increasing way by society at large, including the individual citizens, to respond to the huge and, well, the increasing demand for climate information to address the challenges of climate adaptation and mitigation. The consortium is very large. It's a really well-populated project with 33 partners coming from 13 different countries, and with partners that have a very different nature, including academia from different perspectives, natural and social sciences, but also from the industry, small companies, and technology and innovation providers. One of the aspects that we also wanted to take advantage from Climate Europe was the maintenance of a network that offered an opportunity for those actors in the climate services community that are willing to know each other and to contribute to the definition of what climate services should be, and in what way the recommendations for standardization should be formulated. There are many other activities, again, inspired in Climate Europe, that given their success, it was just obvious that we should carry them forwards. And one of those activities are the Webstivals that are summarized in this slide here, and to which well, you're encouraged to also invite others who might not be aware of it, and let them know that the registration is still open. I would like to close this introduction to Climate Europe 2 without thanking the colleagues at CMCC who are have been acting as a local organizer. If this is a concept that makes sense in the context of a Webstival or an online event, because they have worked very, very hard to make this a reality and are ensuring that we are all here and that we can listen and interact with each other. And that's everything from my side. You'll know much more about Climate Europe 2, but somehow one of the things that I want to say about Climate Europe 2 is that the project itself is not important. What is important is the community, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to bring in as many other projects as possible and offer them the opportunity to give visibility to their projects and interact with everyone else, and basically make our community stronger and larger. And with these words, I would like to give the floor to Jean Doussard, who is a policy officer of the European Commission, DG RTD, working on the Earth observation sector, where he leads the activities of the Commission on the EuroGeo initiative, and the European contribution to the group, which is the European contribution to the group on Earth observation. And before, he was working at the Joint Research Center, working on geospatial technologies and the Inspire directive. So Jean, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Paco, and thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. So, yes, first of all, a big thank you for letting me intervene in this first session of this Climate Europe 2 Webstival. As you introduced me, so I'm working for this DG Research and Innovation from the European Commission in quite a well-named unit, Climate and Planetary Boundaries. So I think it fits quite well with the topic of your Webstival. So together with our colleagues of CINEA, and in particular Alessia Pietrosanti, we play a significant role in securing a core in our Horizon Europe Work Programme 21-22 to support and standardize climate service. And so Climate Europe 2 is really the results from that call. And among the objectives that were assigned to that call, we were expecting to see the coordination and promotion of European climate service activities, encouraging open exchange of knowledge, expertise, and data. It was the expected outcomes of that call. And so I think that this Webstival is really clearly an important occasion to put in practice those overarching objectives assigned to the project and meet already some of our expectations. But of course, we should not stop there. As you know, under Horizon Europe, we have as well launched the concept of the missions, the Horizon Europe missions. They came out of a growing realization during the course of Horizon 2020 of the scale and complexity of the global challenge and opportunities we are facing, notably those involving the climate crisis and the digital transition. So while research and innovation could and should have a pivotal part to play in addressing this challenge, the EU existing way of funding via the innovative actions, the CSAs, etc., and implementation were we consider suboptimal for this role. So the philosophy and design of the mission was therefore a response to those concerns. They are going for a more systematic approach over a longer time frame, using RNI as a spearhead to leverage other EU policies and programs and to gain the support of member states, associate countries, and third countries and private investment. Out of the 5 missions we launch, Climate Europe 2 can certainly help supporting 4 of them. And in particular, our unit in DG Research and Innovation is responsible, together with our colleagues from DG Clima, of the mission on climate adaptation. A very ambitious mission as well, that its overall goal is to support more than 150 European regions and communities towards climate resilience by 2030. This implies, of course, a lot of activities, improve the risk assessment and management of risk by those regions and cities, develop their roadmaps and pathways to achieve a climate resilient future, experiment with and test innovative solutions in terms of water management, agriculture sector, nature-based solution, climate proofing of critical infrastructure, public health. And you see where I'm coming progressively with climate service. Those missions are as well a way to upscale successful solutions towards systematic climate resilience. And so far, we have been quite successful, even if we cannot yet evaluate the impact because this is still work in progress. Those missions have just been launched, but we have already more than 300 regions, cities, and municipalities that have signed the mission charter. It's not a binding political engagement to work together against the mission objective to accelerate the transformation towards becoming climate resilient by 2030. The last news about the mission, we just signed in January a contract for establishing the mission implementation platform. The leading leader is a well-known company, Ricardo Energy and Environment. This platform aims to provide central support to the mission participant and the Commission to implement the mission by coordinating activities and actors, providing technical assistance, monitoring and reporting progress, and stimulating the broader engagement of those cities and regions. What I would therefore invite you is to make sure that the platform that you plan to develop in the Climate Europe 2 project is well connected to this mission implementation platform, that the guidelines, the good practice and capacity building materials that you plan to develop in the course of your projects are made widely available, and you will find immediate usage among this emerging community of regions and local authorities very keen to embark in this ambitious program. I'm very pleased as well to see in the program of the Webstival and on the website of your projects that you are ready to establish a bridge with other Horizon 2020 or Horizon Europe project. For example, I'm the policy officer for the Horizon 2020 E-Shape project that is about that is coming to an end in a few months, in a few weeks even. And for example, I really encourage you to look at the work they did in developing and testing the co-design methodology, because I think it really fits the operational requirements of Earth observation, derived service, delivery and use, can contribute to an impactful adoption of well-adopted co-design process in the Earth observation sector. This is really an effort in this standardization endeavor that you are looking at. Has been applied and tested really seriously among the 37 pilots that E-Shape developed. And this is something we believe that can play an increasing role, including in international initiatives like the GEO initiative, and in particular the development of the post-2025 GEO strategy, or in other major initiatives like Destination Earth. I'm happy as well to see that Protect will intervene in the coming 2 days. This is one of the projects, the call we developed in the Cluster 6 work program 21-22, but this is not the end of the story. You know, the next year we will have a quite ambitious PCP, pre-commercial procurement call with a budget of 19 million to pre-operationalize prototype and user service in the area of climate change adaptation and mitigation. So certainly there will be space for testing the outcomes and the results of your project. Another example is to make sure that the joint specification, the wide publication of the results and where relevant contribution to standardization, regulation or certification can help removing barriers to introduce new innovation into the market. So the uptake aspects of your work will remain, and you know that the Commission with our colleagues of DG DEFIS is working on the uptake strategy together as well with the EUSPA agency. And I would like to finish my short introduction by referring to one key statement I found from the website of your former or mother or sister project, Climate Europe. The climate service is the provision of climate information to assist decision-making. The service must respond to user needs, must be based on scientifically credible information and expertise, and requires appropriate engagement between the users and the providers. And looking at the different components of this definition, responding to user needs, I believe that by opening this Webstival to the climate user, producer, and other stakeholders, you effectively contribute to a strong form of engagement that prepare the path to the uptake of those services. About scientifically credible information and expertise, I think that the quality of your consortium offers the guarantees that science remain at the core of the service you provide. About credible information, I would like as well to remember that it's important to be able to be ready to exploit to a maximum extent the new opportunities of the space program, the Sentinel expansion mission. You will see call as well in 2024 to, for example, develop innovative applications to support the European Green Deal, building on meteorological satellite data with the new generation of satellites that our colleagues of EUMETSAT are planning or have just launched in December. And last but not least, the engagement between the user and the provider. I would encourage you to look outside your community, even beyond Europe. You know that DG Research and Innovation is co-chair as well of this GEO initiative, and we are working hard on its next strategy to cover the decade, the next decade after 2025. And the objectives of that strategy remain the same, serving the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, the Sendai framework, and all those overarching ambitious objectives require to turn in a systematic and standardized way data information into climate intelligence that should be widely disseminated. And I think that Europe can still lead on this, but it requires investment and engagement. I wish you an excellent Webstival, and I really look forward for the exciting session you have scheduled. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I had questions I was going to ask you, and you've answered all of them. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And also, thank you, I mean, personally, the support the European Commission have provided to this landscape, not just the services, the climate services, but the capabilities, the science that you just mentioned, and the capability that underpins these services. The European Commission have been a major supporter of this, not just financially, but also personally and politically. So thank you very much on behalf of the old Climate Europe Consortium and PACO's Climate Europe too. So if it's okay, I'll move us on. So it's now my pleasure to pass over to Roger Street. Roger is somebody I've known like PACO for a very long time. We've interacted and met many, many times in the climate service landscape. So Roger was the former rapporteur of the European Commission's expert group, responsible for developing the European Research and Innovation Roadmap for climate services. I hope you remember that fondly, Roger. And you then moderated the follow-up panel discussion. So Roger, I will now pass over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Chris. And I enjoyed listening to Jean, and and also reflecting back on Climate Europe and looking ahead to Climate Europe too. But just hearing what John was just saying, we have ECA 2023 coming up in June, and just listening to some of the projects he was talking about and some of what we're hoping to include in that, I think will be of interest to people, not only in particular, I should say, in the area of climate services. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more about all those projects, but also hearing the discussions during this Webstival that we're going to hear on the various activities that are going on. But what we've got coming ahead is a panel, a very esteemed member panel. And from that panel, we're going to hear various perspectives on significant contributions or accomplishments in the field of climate services, as well as their perspectives on critical and urgent challenges that need to be tackled, including by Climate Europe too. Now, those of us that have been heavily involved in climate services have been observing that as the needs for knowledge, information, and data have evolved and are continuing to evolve, the provision of such has also tried to keep pace with, but also anticipated these needs and these changes in needs and associated capabilities, as well as the potential that new technologies provide. Understanding, exploring these needs and capabilities and what they mean for the services being developed and how they are developed, as we've just heard from the examples we've just heard, have been the subject of research and innovation investments at various levels. That includes the European Commission, but also at the national level across Europe and internationally, as we'll probably hear during the panel discussions in other countries. But they've also been the subject of various formal assessments, some of which have been focused, such as you just talked about, the roadmap that was in 2015. But there's been subsequent other ones that have undertaken, such as as a result of research and innovation investments in Europe, some of which you and I have been involved in, as well as others, but also some in other countries. And I think that these are things that we need to be aware of, that there's a lot of effort going on in this area, and the need to have a community is essential to bring that and share that information. And that's what I look forward to, these festivals and other activities where these are opportunities. But these assessments have also been behind a lot of the successes and the technological innovations that are driving the efforts to address the remaining challenges and drive advancement in climate service provision and use. And I'm really expecting to hear from today's panel some of those successes and also the remaining challenges that we really need to start focusing on and are being addressed, listening to Jean, for example, but also understanding where Climate Europe 2 is going. I know a lot of them are being addressed. From my perspective, one of the critical challenges towards providing knowledge, information, and data that can better support climate action is dealing with the non-homogeneous nature of climate services and of those that are and should be using climate services. We often say we're dealing with the farming community. Well, you want to talk about a non-homogeneous community. There is one community, if you look across Europe, but also across globally. Now, the goal remains to have relevant, usable, accessible, legitimate, and credible climate services from the perspective of those needing to use those services. And then that's when you start to introduce that non-homogeneity. And we need to recognize this diversity, and this is difficult when we try to recognize that diversity of users in terms of capability and capacities to use the information, the spectrum of uses for which they want to put the climate services to, and the information and data that those climate services have to work together with in order to derive the decisions. There is also, I believe there's also the challenge that accessibility to relevant, usable, and legitimate climate services is not necessarily universal. And that's even within a country or region, and let alone across Europe or globally. And this is a real challenge. And how do we go about it? And there are some activities that I think we're going to hear during the Webstival where they're trying to do this. And Climate Europe 2 are trying to bring that together, as did the Aeronet for Climate Services that was run by the JPI Climate, but also investments in things like Copernicus and Climate Adapt. They're trying to do that. They're trying to, enhance the quality and availability of climate services. But I believe there's a need for more focused investments, including research and innovation, that particularly address the evolving nature of these challenges and explore potential solutions. And this is going to challenge our current thinking about what is private and what is public climate services. That division is going to become grayer and grayer as the evolving nature of the users takes hold and we start to see the effects of it. So this is going to challenge that business model. It's going to challenge the way it flows, the separation. It's going to be less solid, the separation, and more. It needs to be able to have a flow between them to allow us to meet the needs of users and the objectives that we have with respect to climate resilience and mitigation. I'll leave it at that because we have a lot I want to hear from the panels. But prior to hearing from our esteemed panel, I would really like to invite Marta and Andrea to take us through the icebreaker. I'm really excited about this. An icebreaker can be really exciting, but what I'm hoping it will do, it will re-energize all of us that are involved in this webinar, leading into and stimulating our participation in the upcoming panel session. So Marta and Andrea, I guess I'm to hand it over to you, and we'll get to our panel after we see the breaking of the ice.
Perfect. Hi, I hope we fulfill your expectations because I think they are high. But yeah, this icebreaker will be run by my colleague Andrea, who will be in the backstage, and myself. And we have prepared a game for today, a game that we are going to play together. And for doing it, we will need to define two different groups in the audience. One group will be those people that define themselves majorly as climate service providers or potential providers. We know this is a very big simplification, and Roger has been pointing out the different profiles that climate services environment involves. But here, two groups: climate services providers or potential providers, and the other group would be those people that define themselves as climate services users majorly or potential users. So I'm using this word majorly because we know many people define themselves to not to be part of one single group, but they feel they are between both groups because sometimes they act as users because, they use climate services that are generated by others, but other times they act as providers also of climate services, because they are the ones that somehow develop them and then they pass on to the users. But in any case, for this game, you need to decide, and if you are 51% more in the user domain, you pick users. Otherwise, you pick providers. And the objective of the game now, the objective will be to compare thoughts and guesses. Then, in terms of thoughts, we will see what each of these two groups, users and providers, thinks when they think of climate services. And in terms of guesses, which is our second aim, we will see what each of these groups thinks the other group is thinking when they think of climate services. Okay, so I hope I have been clear enough. And if not, let's start playing the game to clarify more the concepts, okay? And you will see that it's not complicated. So you will need to go to the link that is shared in the chat. I think it's here. Okay, very good. So if all of you can go there, I will share my screen in the meantime as well. So we can play together, and then you can see your screen, but also you can go back to what I do, and it will be easier. So at the beginning, you will find this welcome screen where it tells you that the game is going to start, and then you can enter your name here in this place. You can also play as an anonymous, no problem. But then if you win, nobody will know. So you'd better put your name and let's see what happens. Okay. Then once you enter your name, yeah, we wait for a little bit, and then the game will start. So Andrea, perhaps we can go to the next screen. Okay. Okay. So here is when you need to pick up your group. Okay. Decide. It's just a game. So yeah, the one that defines you better. I will pick producers just as an illustration, but each of you need to pick their group. And then, yeah, we will give you some seconds, and then we will continue. Good. So here it starts the game. So what you can see at the top is the current group. So this is the group you have selected. You should be able to see users or producers. And then here is the question. We start by thoughts. Thoughts means our group. Thoughts define yourselves. So what's in your mind when you think of climate services? Please, you can write up to 3 words, as you can see in number 1, 2, 3, but just 1 word in each case. Don't write sentences, just 1 word, because it will be easier to compare. Okay, you can write whatever. I just write 1 word, but please, if you have 3, please go ahead. And then, yeah, we'll give you some time to concentrate. Good. Now the timer is up. So you will have like 25 more seconds. So hurry up until the time's up. And then don't forget to click submit at the end. So when you have the 3 words or 2 or 1, you make submit, and then your answer is sent. Okay, time's up. So now we can go perhaps to the second round. This is the second round. So now we have the guesses, and guesses where, what do we think that the other group thinks? So it's exactly the same. What do you think the other group? So if you are a producer, the users, and if you are a user, the producers, think when they think of climate services. And it's exactly the same. You can enter the same. So 3 words, up to 3 words. And again, you have now 30 more seconds. And don't forget, I was forgetting to click on submit. Okay, time's up again. So we continue. So here in this screen, each of you can see the words that you have added as guesses. So what do you think the other group is thinking? And then on the right, you can see the matches. So it means if another person has also, from the other group, has also written the same word as you thought, you get points. Okay, if the words you have written, nobody in the other group have written these words, then you have 0 points. So this is just for your particular case. And then if we now move. Okay, so here what we can see are 2 different word clouds, okay? So if you look at the word cloud on the left, these are the thoughts of the other group, not of your group, but what the other group is thinking. So depending on the group that you have selected to be part of, you will see a different word cloud. For instance, in my screen, because I'm a producer, I can see that when users think about climate services, they think about information, they think about data, and they think about other things, but basically information and data, because the other words that we can see, they are smaller, you know? And then on the right, you can see the guesses of your group. So what your group thinks, the other group thinks when they think of climate services. They should coincide, but actually it's not exactly so. So, well, yeah, with some of them, information is there as well in terms of what producers think, the users think. And also, let's see if data is there. Data is there, but they think about many more other things like climate, like solutions, relevance, knowledge. So here we see that you know, that producers think that users think on much more things, or perhaps this is only because we have many more producers in the room than users, as you can see as well, because the word cloud is much bigger from the guesses of producers than from the thoughts of users. Okay, so let's go, because this is a little bit complicated, but yeah, here in this other screen, we can see the ranking. So who are the people that, you know, wrote words that match more with the other groups. And here we can see the points that different people got. So Romy, we can see is the winner. And then we have Monzer as well, that has 6 points, and Eva and some anonymous. Okay. So, well, some people got some scores, and then there are many, many, many that got 0. So, yeah, it's not easy. So let's move, Andrea, please, to the next board. And I think this is the most interesting one, and perhaps the easiest one to interpret, because here we have thoughts. We don't have any guesses of what the others think about it, but we can actually see what producers think, what they think of climate services, and what users see. So I think this is, okay, we can see many words here. So for producers, data, adaptation, climate, information, and for users, information, data, mostly because they are less in the room. But here, I think that, well, we have been going through these screens very quickly, but the objective of this game was more comparing these thoughts and guesses, and perhaps also highlight some misconceptions, you know, or some wrong assumptions that each of the groups can have at some point. So sometimes as producers, we think that users believe some things, and as users, we also think that producers, you know, think of some things when they think about climate services. It's true that probably there are some concepts that are understood differently, but we wanted to highlight that the idea here of the Climate Europe 2 project is that to have these interactions among us and be able to, in the long term, bring the thoughts of users and producers a little bit more, you know, closer to each other. And well, that's it with the icebreaker. We don't have time to go into detail in this, but well, we hope you like it. And over again now to the moderator to continue with the session.
Thank you very much, Marta. I enjoyed that. And hope everyone else did. And it got us thinking about where we are when we're having these dialogues. And as I know that Jean mentioned some of the ideas of co-production and some of the thoughts on that and how that's developing. I think a lot of it comes down to co-production and co-design and co-evaluation require at least a similar jargon and an understanding, and what we're getting and what we want and what is needed. Anyways, so I found that interesting. Thank you. As I mentioned prior to the icebreaker, what I'd like to do now is introduce our panel. And I'll introduce them in the order that I'm going to talk. I'm going to, just so you know who's speaking and what's to come. So I'll introduce all 5 of them, and then go through in the order I've introduced them to ask them to provide their inventions. The idea is that the interventions will be 5 to 6 minutes. Well, as one of them told me, make it 5, Roger. But I said 5 to 6 minutes to summarize what they believe have been significant contributions, accomplishments in the field of climate services, as well as from their perspective, critical and urgent challenges that need to be tackled. And then after the discussion, after the panel's interventions, I hope we'll have some time for some questions. So be prepared to ask a few questions through the chat, I assume. I didn't check that. I should have checked that beforehand, but that's the only way I know we can do it. I don't see a Q&A section here, do I? No, yes, there is. There is a Q&A section, if you notice, at least it is on mine, and that's where we like the questions to come in. So I'll start in the order that we're going to have them, and I think it's the order from left to right here. And we're going to have Roger Pulwarty, who is with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the US, where he's a senior scientist. And he's developed. Oh, someone's got their microphone on. Please turn it off. He's developed and led landmark programs integrating science and services. He served as IPCC convening lead authors, co-chairs the WMO Climate Services Information System, the Operation Expert Team, and authored and contributed to related UN-led and US reports and assessments. Kirsten Dunlop is with Climate Kick in the Netherlands. She's the Chief Executive Officer of EIT Climate Kick, a European knowledge and innovation community that's focused on climate change. And they have been heavily involved in trying to understand climate services and the nature of the climate service community. Ocean St. Clair is with the Barcelona Supercomputing Center in Spain and DNV. And she's an IPCC author, senior advisor at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, and climate change lead of the Digital Assurance at DNV, former member of the EC Mission Board for Climate Change Adaptation and Societal Transformation. Jason Lowe is with the Met Office in the UK, and he's the head of the climate services at the Met Office, and has been an IPCC and continues to be an IPCC author. And last but not least is Carlo Buontempo. He's with the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, UK. And it says here you're in the UK, but I'm not too sure if you're still in the UK. And he's the director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service, C3S. As you can see, we've got a wide number of panel members here coming in with various, hopefully different perspectives. And I think together they will really challenge us in our thinking. And I go first to Roger, as I said I would.
Great. Thanks very much, Dr. Street, and thanks everyone for having us here. So in my time, as we think through what has happened, if we look at the situation in the US, in 2001, we defined climate services as the timely production, and I'm old enough to have been involved in this, and delivery of useful climate data and information and knowledge to decision makers. By 2023, we are thinking differently about envisioning a future, not just the operational aspects of climate services, but what's the future to which we're leading? And I'll come back to why that matters to co-production and even larger concepts than co-production. One of the things I helped develop in that time was something called the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, which was physical, social, and decision-making interdisciplinary teams, whose goal was not to develop the services, but help us understand how to craft, govern, manage, and then inform the services. In addition to that, we had other activities such as the early warning information system across climate timescales, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, and so on, in which we're engaged. Other activities, as we think through this and try to draw the lessons, and you've heard this from everyone, from Paco, from Chris, to continuously inform climate services development and implementation with credible science and observations. We're all quite clear about that ourselves. Establish the partnerships, identify requirements, develop the tools, the capacity development. And it's in this capacity development piece that I'm going to come back in distinguishing between capacity and capabilities in order to act. Two very different things in my view. And of course, issues such as relevance and something we're all struggling with, which is not just salience, legitimacy, and credibility, but the nature of what constitutes authoritative, quality assured data and information. There's no single approach. We all would agree on that. Solutions emerge over time, and sustaining the diverse relationships become the most key things. When we think about those things, we can come back to very direct operational needs, such as insurance, operating reservoirs. To me, those are what we call ordinary or straightforward policy problems in which we know the goal and we're working back from it. But when dealing with complex systems and the systemic, increasingly systemic nature of risk, that linear approach to the use of information actually does not work in practice, or worse, it leads us to maladaptive responses. It makes us, as I like to say, it helps us do the wrong thing with better data. And so as we think through this, and we, working with Chris and others, we've gone and evaluated, governance, basic systems, user interfaces, capacity, as I mentioned, the different types of monitoring and evaluation. But I wanted to focus on a couple of key issues as we move climate services forward. The issue of systemic risks, which we're all aware of, and we're seeing more and more, not just cascading, but compounding, different kinds of things. The role of nature-based solutions and how we design those using better climate information, not, again, a form of just resilient design. And the management, and then this issue of the accumulated nature of risk. We just released the International Science Council report on the Sendai midterm. And a key part of that was recognizing that, yes, we have events. Yes, they interact with society, but it's the accumulative nature in which we construct risk that makes them a disaster. Not just, okay, we know risk is socially constructed, but it's done so over time, which is not always taken into account. So more important to me than advancing climate services in co-production is co-creation, co-design, and shaping a future, of which co-producing tools and processes are one piece, but not necessarily the driver. It is the outcome of having those partnerships. So as we think through this in the public-private sectors, the civil society areas in which we work, the operational view of climate information requires a systems view of risk governance, as we transition through a changing climate, as opposed to, here's the projections, how do you respond? Determining the drivers, the anatomy of the changing nature of extremes themselves, not the statistics of extremes per se, but in the flooding in the middle of the US that occurred in 2019, 2021, without accounting for the freezing of the ground that occurred months before, we would not have had a good assessment of flooding. So simple diagnostics extracted from post-processed climate model output would not have given you that estimate of a changing environment. So the joint visioning, the foresight planning, this issue of aligning capabilities becomes a really key part of services beyond the consultancy, which is important. Co-developing the regional and sectoral risks and vulnerability profiles, and we can talk about how we've tried to do that. I'm sure others here have. And most critically, why are you better off? There are three forms of trust we engage in when we deal with climate services. The first two we're familiar with. One is the rational nature of trust. How quality assured and reliable is the information, whether it's satellite data or are we releasing the manifestations at local levels that we think are borne out by the climate system. The second is procedural, who is engaged, and we're all familiar, and Roger eloquently stated that. The third is really, in a changing climate, the nature of affinitive trust. Why should others believe that you have their interest at heart? And so as we think through that, I'm at the UN water meeting at the moment, and the 2 days before this, we held a workshop with indigenous peoples around the world, and that third type of trust was the most important thing that emerged. So that makes rational, and procedural important. As we think through this, we know there are many global mechanisms, but the three most important to us are Paris, the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction, and the 2030 Agenda. And we know we're not meeting them. I did an op-ed just earlier this year, basically showing the point that without thinking through the issue of biodiversity and what we need to create early warning systems that are based on the scientific information and on the depletion of our natural buffers, without those, we will not engage in a resilient future. So as Roger and others point out, the broader actor network is not just about bringing the user in. The user is embedded in financial systems, in cognitive systems, in cultural. So it's not simply what does a farmer want and how does he or she use the information. And we know that in this context. I'm just trying to broaden it out because what we're really after is an alignment to show that one cannot meet climate change adaptation goals independently of disaster risk reduction, water resources and energy and food. So the coherence of those goals become extremely important. To wrap up, I will say usability is important, robustness is important, but making better decisions is even more important, right? That's why we're trying to do both of those things. And in that setting, taking the systems view requires that we look across the risk to resilience continuum, that we ask not just how to be proactive, but how to be prospective. How do we not let new risks arise? And how we scale up from adaptation pilots to adaptive social, economic, and environmental systems. The missing piece, a missing piece that we're all representative of, but we're not doing systematically, and Radha and others have talked about this, is who is to do it? What, is it just people with more tools, more statistics, doing GIS badly, but still doing it on the ground? It's really this notion of transdisciplinarity that is not simply about tools, but who works in knowledge about a process, who studies it, and knowledge in a process, how it is developed. To that extent, taking a systems view requires that cadre of professionals understand the impediments to the flow among the different pieces, the policies and practice that arise to an information system and ecosystems, the barriers and opportunities to iterative learning and innovation. We've tried with some of those experiments in the Caribbean since 2003. We now have about 150 bright young people across the region who bring voice, connectivity, and data to the Climate Outlook forums and to the climate services system. So of all of these, I think the people that hold the glue together and are sustained in doing it without quick turnover is actually the most reliable, trusted sources for making the connections work in climate services. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Roger.
I'm now going to ask Kirsten Dunlop with Climate Kick. Kirsten, hopefully you'll be able to come in.
Yes, I can. Thank you very much, Roger. Just checking the sound is okay?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm conscious that I'm speaking from an organization that is bridged between producers and users, and very helpful. And thank you very much for this kind of wonderful confrontation and comparison and sort of cross-pollination of perspectives. I'm speaking on behalf of EIT Climate Kick, one of the members of the Climate Europe 2 Consortium and CSA group. Very, very pleased and committed to continuing to work on the relationship between the development of climate services as a field of practice and the application and implementate the use of climate services in the work of large-scale transformations of European cities, regions, communities, businesses, and the work that we are doing beyond Europe to develop innovation capabilities, and particularly to develop mirrored partnerships around the notion of large-scale place-based transformations and value chain-based transformations. So my perspective is, or at least I'm going to speak from the perspective of a practitioner organization, looking at a few things. How can climate services develop as a field of practice and a field of service to those who are engaged in the business of self-transformation of all types? And I mean that at the largest possible scale of whole countries and cities down to the scale of individual homes or businesses. How can we think about the critical questions of scale to the point where it is possible to start thinking about shaping markets and shaping decision-making at scale and at an aggregated level? And how can we think about climate services, and this is where I would very much build on Roger's comments, as an active part of live learning and feedback loops that are engaging with those who are seeking to implement transformation on the ground, where we begin to understand the interactions and the interrelations and the critical interrelations between human system responses, ecosystem responses, climate responses, as a nested set of elements that are absolutely essential for us to be embedded in and to be learning as quick as possible from. So my response to the question that Roger, you posed around what do we see as being the most significant accomplishments in the field of climate services so far, coming through the programs, the various Climate Europe, the Copernicus Macro System, the Climate Europe 2. I think I'd probably speak to three things: the effort to form a field, and by field I mean a field of practice with all of the characteristics and structures and kind of nascent structures and practices and institutional forms and rituals, cultural practices that begins to have, made up very much of the shift that Roger referred to from co-production towards co-creation, dialogue, participation, involvement, asking questions around justice and accessibility, usability that become absolutely essential. I think my second observation would be the usefulness or the recognition of the critical element of streamlining relevance of climate services into multiple sectors, so that it is possible to start thinking in terms of aggregated demand, need, and then eventually the interrelation of those kinds of aggregations into one another, and the much more sophisticated kind of real-time, large-scale and micro-scale decision-making and decision support that is needed. I would want to acknowledge that in that process, standardization is an absolutely essential lever, and translation across demand and supply at multiple levels to try and get to the possibility of thinking in terms of more aggregated levels. And that's where we still have a very significant set of challenges in terms of dispersion of both supply and demand. And the third element has been, for those of us who are on the ground, working to pull together innovation portfolios, connect innovation experience to policy, regulation, regulatory sandboxes, financial mobilization, decision support. There is, in a much more consolidated forming field of climate services, it is extremely helpful to be able to start drawing in some of the elements that allow you to speak to counterfactual risk. It's not just a question of, are you doing enough, or what does it mean, or what is its cost? Here you can begin to look at the space around not doing and start to form and understand and model and introduce elements around scenario thinking and scenario modeling that really, really help decision ambition, actually, the ambition for transformation. Where do I think there are critical and urgent challenges that Climate Europe 2 would really wish to tackle? For me, there are four. One is this question of feedback loops and live monitoring, live learning, kind of shortening up the ability to connect what is happening, what we are observing, the robustness of the science coming into that, but increasingly the possibility to monitor. And if I'm speaking here specifically thinking of the climate cities, the cities mission, the European Mission on Cities, which is a commitment of 112 cities to decarbonize by 2030. To do that in 7 years means mobilizing an enormous combination of interventions and efforts. And of course, one of the critical elements at stake is every single month that passes, every year that passes, how are we doing? Is it working? Is it not working? Is it having a material effect? What are the unexpected interrelations? How is any effort in decarbonization relating to climate change effects or to adaptation, resilience, responses? What can the field of climate services offer in terms of enhanced learning, enhanced decision support, decision options, and some sense of that really essential shift to prospective thinking and agile decision making, because you are fundamentally you're dealing with deep uncertainties and the need to act in a context of uncertainty with a degree of confidence that you will have a learning mechanism in place and a live feedback mechanism in place to allow you to act forward. And that is not just a question of civic actors, cities and regions. It's critically a question of the businesses and industries that have to come in alongside that order and scale and pace of change. The second key challenge, I think, is strategic integrated approaches, really starting to introduce systemic thinking, systemic design, and systematic and strategic integration of relationships, of effects, of decision inputs and outcomes, and of engagement between, among, and across actors and across sectors. That's easy to say. We know it is incredibly difficult to do, partly because our entire world is not structured to enable or facilitate or support such thinking and such action. So you're asking climate services to do something that is simply not happening in the current world of individual industrial sectors, even departmental budget thinking, city planning, regional planning. However, one of the beauties of Earth observation is that you're seeing the Earth as a whole. So perhaps there is a space here to start thinking about how do you look for and see systems in ways that are effectively pulling through a more sophisticated systems literacy in decision making. The third element is around behavioral change. I think we are reflecting the fact, whether it's the Club of Rome Earth for All report, it is an increasing understanding of the impacts on nature and the accumulated nature risks, the impact of biodiversity, the elements in which we start to understand, even just from an economic perspective, thinking of human health and planetary health together allows us to draw in co-benefits, allows us to draw in revenue streams that we haven't thought of. Being able to put the services, the decision support, information support, data services into that mix starts to become absolutely essential. And that means, how do we introduce in the construct of climate services in the field of practice, observation and decision support and information on poverty, equity, well-being, human and health and planetary health, societal health, political health, participatory decision-making, the elements that are very definitely, I suspect, still out of scope, and yet so fundamental if we want to change the way humans are expecting to live and making daily choices, community choices, school choices, street by street choices. And that leads me perhaps to the fourth point, which is a passionate plea for reintegrating, in everything we are doing, reintegrating art and science. And I don't mean kind of visual arts exhibitions about climate change. I mean the art of supporting decision in a context of uncertainty, complexity, and diversity. And some of that really comes down, for example, to visualization. When we say accessibility, often what we need to be thinking about is how do we form and support in ways of consuming information that become effectively translatable and effectively consumable about a range and diverse group of users. I would love to see VR, AR, gaming really start to engage with climate services so that you start to create visual, three-dimensional fields where we have expert practices in the field of culture and creative industries that could be used to start to pull the field of climate services into rapid decision support, meaning-making and sense-making, and narratives and evidence, not just of the evidence of climate impacts, but beginning of narratives and evidence of choices that are sustainable, and the positive reinforcing loops that we need to start to encourage people to think of, expect, ask for, normalize. Thank you very much, Roger.
Thank you, Kirsten. Some very interesting points there. Thank you very much. Osun.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. I took a point of departure inspired this week by the release of the IPCC synthesis report when I was thinking about the accomplishments of climate services, because the text very clearly says that climate services have already demonstrated a wide applicability across sectors to enhance adaptation options, and also that there is high confidence they serve as guides in the systemic transformation needed towards low carbon solutions in all aspects of the economy and across all societies. So I think this is a good reminder that we have gotten a long way with climate services. But with that comes, I think, an issue that has just been addressed by Kristen, and that is that we urgently need an ongoing iteration in the co-production and use of climate services for the next decades, helping us, guiding us in forging a sustainable and resilient future that we want. And that means that climate services need to scale, and they need to do so at speed and actually become a regular practice when advancing adaptation and mitigation foresight that is informed by science, and a science that is able to tell us both current climate change and medium to longer term climate evolution. So it's a huge, huge challenge. I think what matters is that climate services become a key component of climate governance as the key elements that support and steer action towards climate resilience, action not only by scientists, this is important, but steering the action of everyone that is acting on climate issues. And we need, furthermore, to create a continuity from the information to the eventual outcomes of that adaptation, mitigation, sustainable development, and to do so iteratively over time, because things are going to change and the problems are going to change as we move along. And here is where I think we need a trustworthy ecosystem of climate services with co-responsible providers, intermediaries, and users, and everybody that is in between all these categories. And I also think this is where Climate Europe comes in, partly driven by the European Climate Governance Toolbox, of which standardization is actually one key element. Standardization is, in fact, a form of governance. Because in order to achieve trustworthiness, we need to do something very difficult. We need to reach a point where there is a widely shared view of what constitutes a benchmark for a minimally viable climate service that is appropriately co-designed, delivered appropriately and effectively, and able to inform this steering of adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development actions. And I think in Climate Europe too, what we are trying to do, and we are already doing, is trying to build a consensus on what are the different elements or components of climate services, an agreement on terminology, all seen from different standpoints, from policy actors and communities to market actors or industry. And the task is here to explore what can be this agreed set of benchmarks from a technical, a procedural, and efficiency aspects of climate services, and also to be able to see those from different standpoints. And this, of course, also requires, which is a huge task, understanding what are the relevant existing benchmarks and existing gaps, whether those are WMO, ISO, Sense and Elect standards, or industry-specific, or even those set by the financial sector, such as the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which are crucially important, particularly for industry. So the issue here for all of us is that this work can only be done if engaging with the stakeholders and knowledge holders of all domains, private sector policy, those responsible for adaptation plans and risk assessments, and to be able to capture not only the requirements for trustworthiness, but also to understand the conditions for trustworthiness, which are much more sticky and much more difficult. And at the same time, we need to be able to harvest and learn from all the ongoing sister projects and previous research and ongoing research on climate services. So that's quite huge, but a reason also why, if you recall the presentation of the project at the beginning by Paco Doblas, how and why the key objectives of Climate Europe 2 is standardization, supporting the community, and increasing uptake are all intrinsically intertwined. But amongst of all, and I want to emphasize this part, I think what is important is that we need to work towards an equitable community of climate services, and we need to be able to envision equitable standardization processes. So what can those be? Equitability in a standardization processes is actually very common. And it flows from the insight that the process is as important as the outcome. If you have a very bad process, it's impossible to have a good standard, a good set of benchmarks. So the processes must be not only inclusive and participatory, but they must be empowering and respectful of diversity. That is, they need to be processes conducive to the type of community and the type of future that we are using those climate services as decision aids to execute and to reach out. Building standards is about building consensus and cooperation, and in doing so, facilitate innovation, enable consistency, and ensure interoperability. But this, and this is very important, should not create winners and losers, least of all in the field of climate change. On the contrary, and most of you know the meaning of equitability because it entails the recognition that not all things are equal. Thus, in this project, and here is a huge challenge as well, we need to identify the areas or aspects of climate services that should not be subjected to formal standardization because it will be a mistake. It may lead to inequity. And those issues might be best treated with informal guidance or best practices flexible enough to adapt to a specific context and not to leave anybody behind. And I want to conclude by saying something about this idea of building an equitable community of climate services. Equitable, it's important because it needs to help leveling the playing field to ensure different actors with diverse capabilities and diverse beginning points are able to find spaces to work together. So we need that capability of working together and leveling the playing field so that is in fact achievable. We need a community that not only respects diversity and is professional on transdisciplinarity, but is also driven by inclusiveness. And this is a high mark. And I will also say, and this is an idea that a colleague in the consortium told us recently, that we want a community not only built on values, fairness, and respect, but also a community that cares. And care is important here because if you, again, remember the launch of the IPCC synthesis report, one of the big highlights was technology alone is not going to get us to a resilient future. And that is why we need to be very deeply attentive to the social and human dimensions of the work we do as we try to create this leveling field, as we try to work on a standardization processes and create benchmarks for a minimum amount of quality. Let's remember that we are, after all, and many of the colleagues that have already spoken have already mentioned this, we use climate services to inform how to build better futures and to assess very complex trade-offs which impact our well-being and the well-being of others. So these are, in short, many or some of the challenges and the work ahead. And I hope that in the next 2 days, with all the participation of all of you listening in, can help us moving forward to figure out how to actually do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Osun. Very much enjoyed that. It's really interesting how I'm seeing all of you all of you using words like trust. And I think that's in the various dimensions of that trust, as we've heard. And I think that's really important to take that into consideration and what we mean by that. Jason.
Thanks, Roger. I guess my starting point is also to reflect this week on the IPCC synthesis report, because it has reminded us that the climate has already changed, and we're seeing the effects of climate change in extremes around the world, and those extremes are translating into impacts on real people. It also tells us that there are ways to mitigate and adapt, and we're seeing some examples of good practice, but we're not seeing it enough at scale. The other aspect of framing, I guess, that really stands out for me is the transition that I've seen probably over the past 4 or 5 years, moving from climate services really trying to define the problem, focusing what's wrong, focusing how bad it might get, and increasingly moving towards how we can provide a solution. how we can help move towards a better, more resilient, low carbon future. Now, where have those steps forward come from? And there's no single magic bullet. There have been developments in lots of areas of climate services. I think the first one is that we have spoken for a very long time about, look, this crosses disciplines. And we've talked about multidisciplinary, but we've struggled to go beyond that. We've struggled to actually go to interdisciplinary and work together across the disciplines, embedding those different skills in teams as we need them. And I think now we're starting to see more examples of where we're not only achieving interdisciplinary, but we're going to transdisciplinary. We're bringing in people beyond the academic sector into the process. And I think that reflects the improvements more generally in COEX, co-development, co-production, co-monitoring. It's because we take a more balanced view of the different roles, the different stakeholders in climate services and climate response. I think we've also got better at thinking about the types of data and information that are needed for particular types of decisions. And I think we have developed a more mature view on the difference between decision making in a very theoretical sense, where we try to optimize utility, and we've progressed towards decision making in the real world, better understanding the enablers and the barriers to decision making. I think we've also progressed in being able to feed back what is needed from the climate science by services. And although that needs to be made much, much stronger, we're starting to see good examples of the need from climate services feeding back into model development, observational data set development. We've seen advances in global coordination, and we're starting to see that also on a national scale with more and more national frameworks for climate services. We're currently debating that in the UK. And probably most encouraging is that we have started to see more uptake of climate services. And that uptake has involved people from the government sector, from the private sector, and from academia, often working together. Where do we need to go to improve? If I had to pick one right at the top of my list, it is scaling up climate services. I think we have lots of pilots, we have lots of demonstrators. We can often show that they're successful, but we struggle to take them to wider audiences and have that large scale impact. So we need to scale up, and we also need to make the services sustainable. So there's a clear route that we can keep accessing those services. We need to monitor the effectiveness of those services so we know what good looks like. And we need to make sure there is proper quality assurance in place. Quality assurance is absolutely key, because if we look at the current climate service sector, there's a real spread in the quality of what's available. We also need to think about the idea of how we can sort of take this systems view and not only use it in terms of impacts and response, but also think across policy, regulation, and industry and citizen, and understand how those individual roles within the system play out and how we can best inform them. My final point is that although we may have seen some progress in the area, we're still often coming up climate services assuming that somebody is making a climate decision. Mostly they're making a decision, and climate is one factor, and it may actually be quite a small factor in many decisions, certainly at present. And we need to get better at making sure we're taking this holistic view of decisions. I'll stop there, Roger, in the interest of time.
That's okay. No, Jason, not to worry. I've been given permission. I can go over a little bit in time. So if you had more to do, but I thought those were critical points, but do you have others that you wanted to make?
So I guess there were two others that I probably would put. One of those is how we actually overcome what are often very fragmented delivery of services. And I think we certainly see that in some sectors within the UK. So you might look at water, and I think that's quite well organized, but you look at many other areas like finance sector, for instance, and you often hear this term of the Wild West. It's not just about driving up and monitoring quality, it's also thinking about how we share good practice. So that issue of fragmentation is really important to think about. The other one is really about uncertainty. Uncertainty is something that certainly those of us who come into this discipline from a physical science background very much have at the forefront of our minds. In my experience, most of the people who would perhaps identify as a user are also concerned about uncertainty. They might use a very different language. And I think we're still struggling to bridge that language barrier and that technique barrier of uncertainty, and recognize that uncertainty is not something to be frightened of or avoided. It is something to be explored, to embraced and brought into the decisions and made as transparent as possible.
Thank you, Jason. I'm a strong believer in your last point. I mean, all data and information has uncertainty when it's dealing with the future, even the past, but especially when dealing with the future. And it has value if you want to make your decisions more robust, because we can never be certain about the future unless we get rid of all the people.
all the people, and it's no longer a chaotic system.
Yes, exactly.
The point is, uncertainty might change in magnitude, but it's not going to go away.
Yeah.
And we need to manage that in effective ways.
Okay, thanks very much. Last but not least, Carlo Buontempo, who is in Bonn, not in the UK, which I knew he wasn't in the UK. And but Carlo, are you able to join us now?
Yes, can you hear me?
Great, great.
Very
yes.
good. Thank you, Roger. And it's a pleasure to be with you in this wonderful panel. Very nice discussion. I know we are pressed on time, so I will keep my point short, and I will answer to the question you put to us on the successes and then the challenges. I think there are two clear successes on climate services. The first one is the fact that, in many respects, climate services have been mainstream already. They are happening. They're happening in the fabric of society. They're happening in a number of sectors. And it's really a diffuse and very dynamic environment in the world of climate services that is difficult to embed under a single definition. So I think that's probably, looking back, the most important success. And I know I am the last one on the panel, so I need to say something provocative, otherwise people will lose attention. So I'm tempted to say that we are beyond user engagement, in the sense the point has been made so loud, and there is so much of a societal need that that is happening, that there is this request from society that, if anything, we are struggling to keep up with. And this leads to one of the challenges I will explain in a second. But let's stick to the successes for now. The second success for me is really the fact that over the last, let's say, decade, we made leapfrog improvement in the provision of climate services, especially of climate data. So climate data is not per se climate service, but is an important ingredient for the mainstreaming and the operationalization of climate services. And I just want to bring two examples of that success. One for me is the success itself that the Climate Atlas had with respect to the IPCC. So that was a way of presenting the data to the user that probably represented the most important novelty of the last assessment report. And the second one for me is just the sheer size of the audience of, for instance, the Climate Data Store on Copernicus that has just passed the 180,000 user, hundreds of terabytes per day. It's just unbelievable. Even just a couple of years ago would have been difficult to imagine. And if you look at the audience, if you look at these people that are using the data, then you really realize how diverse and complex the landscape is. It's not just academia. I mean, this mirrors some of the comments that have been mentioned before. It's really a diverse community that span different realms of society, often intertwined. And this probably links to my first challenge. I have three. The first one is that we are limited by our own thinking about the problem in many respects. And in that sense, I embrace what Kirsten was saying before about the connection to the arts. I think we have to rethink some of the aspect of how we think about climate services. I remember when we started on climate services and with Chris and Paco and you, Roger, I was coordinating Euporias with Chris, and one of the mantra of Euporia was not to build yet another portal of climate information. We had enough of those, and I think that kind of thinking, or that mantra, is still valid to many, to a large extent, even now. We still think with a mindset that probably is more typical of the 90s rather than the world that is around us. I would like to pick up from the thinking of WCRP Lighthouse activity on my climate risk, that when talking about climate services, use the metaphor of the mycelium, this network, fungal network that connects forestry, the forest under the ground, and connects fungi and plants and transmits vital substances, but also information. Well, I think climate services and data and information work a bit as in a mycelium. And when you are in a network, it's not a centralized organization that matters, it's really the network that matters. And if you're operating in a network, then you need standards, you need standardized interface, you need a common vocabulary, as Asun was saying before, you need common assessment of quality. So I think we have to rethink the way in which we think about climate services, and rethinking in a network way, where there won't be any single point. And this is true for any climate service provider or any climate service user, in my opinion. And it's also something that is being reflected in the discussion around what the global framework for climate services should be in the future. It's no longer possible to think of governing top-down this universe that climate services is becoming. The second point, or the second challenge for me, partly linked to what Jason was saying a minute ago, and is the ability of having an effective feedback loop. Now, all of us have referred back to the IPCC, and the report that was released just a few hours ago. But one of the striking feature in that report is that figure that now has been tweeted, I think, billions of times, about the path to the 1.5 degrees and how steep that path is. If we want to stick to that optimistic view of the future, then we need to be very reactive, and reactive to the new requirement, reactive to the new societal need. And we need to do better than we have been able to do in feeding back those requirements into service, into science, into transformation. So I think the feedback loop in climate services is not yet working. And this links back to this concept of network or mycelium. So even thinking of user requirement collection, analysis, and implementation of requirement in a network. I don't know what it means, but I think is something that needs to happen, and happen very rapidly. The third and last challenge is somehow linked again to some of the comments and some of the questions that were raised before. And for me is about the inclusion of the users in the chain. So we often operate in an environment where we think that there is the natural world and then there is us, as if we were external to the natural world. And in this global context that climate change imposes on us, we are very much part of the system. And in a sense, we need to move into a setup where our decisions, our policy actually are factor in our climate simulation and our climate thinking. So that's what, for instance, Destination Earth is starting to thinking of, but very much from a natural science kind of viewpoint. And to pick up from some of the previous comments, I think we need more climate, of social scientists. We need a better understanding of the context in which some decision and policy are developed, decisions are taken and policy are developed. Also because, I couldn't agree more with Jason, these are decisions and policies that may have a climate angle, but may depend on very many other factors. So it's really understanding that context to ensure that this information coming out of the mycelium can actually make a difference. And this can well happen, in a context that goes beyond the normal realm, and the idea of involving gaming or immersive reality or metaverse in some shape or form can well be part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlo. All of those were quite interesting, and I know there have been some questions. The only one remaining, Jason, you might want to take a look at that one question: obstacles to scaling of climate services. And maybe you have an answer that you can put to that. We're a little bit over time, and I apologize to everyone for that. That's partly my problem. But I felt it was very interesting to get the ideas coming across and these perspectives, as this will allow us to move into our thinking tomorrow and the third day as well. Now, what I'd like to do now, because I don't want to take up any more time, is just conclude this session and thank our panel very much. I'm hoping that we'll be able to reflect on these, and this information that you've shared with us, these perspectives, will be quite useful. And there's a common message, as I heard through all of these, that building a trust, that the move to more transdisciplinarity in terms of the provision and better understanding the use and how we can make better use of climate services, but how all those services are also need to evolve, because the services that are there today may not be, and I doubt they will be, as effective in the next 3 or 4 years as we move and our decisions and our capabilities change, and then making use of different technologies. So I found that very useful. I had a whole bunch of points I was going to use, and I have to shut down now because we're getting on with that. But I want to point to and give you an overview of the program for the second and third day of the Webstival. And hopefully you'll be able to join us. You'll note you'll have to use a different link than the one you maybe joined today on. We'll just double check that link is still valid. But if you look at the second and third day, we're going to have World Cafe sessions on various thematic areas related to some of the questions that Climate Europe is dealing with. And things tomorrow start at 10 o'clock CET. And really not want to take a look at that. And we have some plenary introductions. And additionally, as you'll notice when we go through these sections, that we'll have opportunities to understand what different other projects, European projects, are providing. And you can see those in the agenda. Some of those, such as Reach Out, Vidigos, Protect, and eShape for tomorrow. And on day 3, we're really going to go to the Aspect Users Forum and the Mission Adaptation, Climate and Vulnerability Assessments Toolbox. And then the Gala closing. Now, I noticed that a lot of us had dressed up for the Gala opening, and I'm hoping we'll do the same thing for the Gala closing session on the third day. So thank you very much. I assume I can just say goodbye to everyone for the day, or should I be saying thank you again to our panel? Really appreciated that. I learned a lot. And to everyone else, looking forward to the discussions tomorrow and on Friday. Thank you again, and have a good evening wherever you are. Bye now.